For 4,000 years, the Bohai Sea has been the northern cradle of Chinese civilization. Fishing dynasties cast their nets into its shallow, silt-laden waters. Trade fleets moved grain and silk across its surface. Emperors built fortifications along its coast. And for every one of those 4,000 years, every civilization that has planted itself on its shoreline has understood one unambiguous truth about the Bohai. You inhabit its edges. You do not colonize its interior. The sea is not land. It does not become land simply because you desire it to. The soft, compressed clay of the Bohai's seabed, laid down over millennia by silt washed from the Yellow River and the Liao River, is a treacherous, pressurized material that compresses under weight, expels water under load, and subsides continuously and inexorably beneath anything heavy enough to trigger its slow, geological surrender. Every empire that ever confronted the Bohai recognized this. They built on the shore. They left the sea alone. Logic dictates that any coastal city requiring a new airport should build inland or at worst on marginal coastal land. It should not build in the open sea. Japan already demonstrated at catastrophic, permanent, ongoing cost precisely what happens when engineers attempt to command the ocean to become solid ground. Kansai International Airport opened in Osaka Bay in 1994, the world's first fully offshore airport, constructed on an artificial island in 18 to 20 meters of seawater. The engineers knew the clay seabed would compress. They installed 2.2 million vertical sand drains to accelerate consolidation. They calculated the subsidence. They were wrong. Within a decade, the island had sunk 3 times faster than predicted. By the 2010 mark, parts of the original island had sunk approximately 11 meters below where they began. In 2018, Typhoon JB pushed a storm surge across the runway, flooded the airport, destroyed the only road bridge connecting the island to the mainland, and stranded thousands of passengers. Kansai is a monument to what happens when engineers mistake controlled subsidence for victory. It has been sinking continuously for 30 years and will continue sinking for decades to come. The ocean collected its debt slowly, patiently, and without mercy. This is the precedent. This is the warning. In 2016, China announced it would build an airport in the Bohai Sea that would make Kansai look like a municipal landing strip, not on the coast, not adjacent to the shore. In the open bay, 4.5 kilometers from the nearest land, on a completely artificial island 20 square kilometers in area, larger than the entire footprint of Manhattan south of 14th Street, 4 runways, a single passenger terminal spanning 900,000 square meters under one roof, capacity for 80 million passengers per year and 1 million tons of cargo. The project Dalian Jinzhouwan International Airport. The deadline, 2035. The cost, an initial estimate of 26.3 billion yuan, approximately 4.3 billion US dollars, a figure that virtually every independent analyst regards as radically optimistic for a project of this geological and logistical complexity. The sea did not receive an invitation to object. This is the story of how China, undeterred by the most spectacular and expensive subsidence failure in aviation history, is manufacturing solid ground from the floor of the Bohai Sea, driving more than 3,000 concrete pillars through soft marine sediment and into bedrock 80 meters below the waves, and constructing on top of that engineered foundation the largest offshore airport the world has ever seen, betting that the accumulated engineering knowledge of 30 years of island airports is finally sufficient to defeat an ocean that has been absorbing and destroying human ambition since before recorded history began. To feel the true hostility of Jinzhou Bay, you must strip away the satellite imagery and confront the geology raw. The Bohai Sea is the shallowest of China's marginal seas, a semi-enclosed, turbid body of water averaging barely 18 meters in depth, warm enough in summer to breed violent cyclonic storm surges that pile water against the coast faster than any seawall can drain it. The seabed beneath Jinzhou Bay is a geological trap, soft, saturated, compressible clay deposited over 10,000 years of post-glacial sedimentation, layered above deeper diluvial clay equally capable of slow, irreversible consolidation under sustained vertical loading. Pour enough material into this bay to create 20 square kilometers of artificial land, and you are not creating a stable platform, You are loading a geological spring that will compress, expel pore water, and settle downward for decades. Once reclaimed, the tidal flats that served as fish nurseries and migratory bird staging grounds along the East Asian-Australasian flyway are gone permanently. And above the waterline, the bay is exposed to Bohai storm surges and winter ice formation, events that batter seawalls with hydraulic forces that have no interest in construction schedules. The strategic desperation behind this project is real, and it is absolute. Dalian is one of China's most critical northeastern port cities, a major industrial and trade hub on the Liaodong Peninsula, but it is physically imprisoned by the mountains that ring its urban core. The existing Dalian Jinzhouwan International Airport is hemmed in on all sides by urban development and mountain terrain that make any meaningful runway expansion structurally impossible. And China's aviation market, already the second largest on Earth, is projected to more than double its passenger volume by the mid-2030s, with northeastern China, Liaoning Province, Jilin, Heilongjiang, representing some of the most capacity-starved airspace in the country. Without a new airport of transformative scale, Dalian's commercial, industrial, and logistical development faces a permanent ceiling imposed not by economics or policy, but by geography. Building on land was not an option. Building in the sea became the only answer to a question that had no comfortable alternative. The engineering weapon deployed against Jinzhou Bay is an assault of manufactured land. Massive dredging fleets drew sand from offshore extraction zones and pumped it onto the reclamation footprint, building the island layer by layer. But raw dumped fill is not structural material. It is unconsolidated sediment that will shift, liquefy under seismic loading, and settle unpredictably under runways and terminal structures. To transform it, engineers deployed dynamic compaction. Enormous steel weights dropped repeatedly from cranes, sending shock waves through the fill that collapse void spaces and densify the granular structure to engineered specifications. In zones where underlying clay was too soft even for that, vacuum preloading was applied, drainage strips driven into the seabed, sealed membranes spread across the surface, and industrial vacuum pumps pre-compressing the clay before any permanent structure was placed on it. And beneath all of this, punching through reclaimed fill, through soft marine sediments, through diluvial clay layers, down to competent bedrock, more than 3,000 reinforced concrete piles were driven to depths exceeding 80 meters. At 80 meters in length, driven through saturated clay under open sea conditions, they represent some of the most technically demanding foundation engineering attempted anywhere on the planet. The numbers dismantle every scale reference an airport engineer has ever used. 20 square kilometers of artificial island, more than 3 times the total area of Kansai International Airport's 2 islands combined. 900,000 square meters of passenger terminal under a single roof, a structure so vast that if you laid it flat, you could fit the entire footprint of the Pentagon inside it 14 times. 4 runways designed to handle simultaneous wide-body aircraft operations at the throughput rates of the world's busiest hub airports. 80 million passengers per year at full operational capacity, more than the current annual throughput of London Heathrow, the busiest airport in Europe. The seawall protecting the island's perimeter must be engineered to withstand storm surges generated by the worst typhoon on record, making a direct strike on the Bohai, a structure of armored concrete and engineered rock that rings the entire 20 square kilometer footprint with a defensive wall designed to hold back water levels that no one alive has yet witnessed. The initial campaign against the sea produced genuine, verifiable progress. By the close of 2025, the land reclamation phase, the raw act of filling the bay with hundreds of millions of cubic meters of material, was substantially complete. The island existed, it occupied space. It pushed the Bohai back and held the line. Government approvals for the flight area design were secured in mid-2026. Foundation work for terminal infrastructure began advancing across the reclaimed surface. The seawall stood. Engineers declared the geology sufficiently stabilized for the next phase of structural work. For a project of this audacity, in a sea of this hostility, with a foundation challenge of this complexity, early milestones arrived. The narrative was disciplined, confident, and militarily controlled. China was winning, but Kansai has been speaking since 1994, in the language of millimeters, a slow, cumulative dialect that describes the gap between what engineers calculated and what the ocean delivered. The sand drains were correctly installed. The consolidation theory was sound, and then the deeper diluvial clay layers, underestimated in thickness, began their own slower consolidation, adding meters of settlement no model had predicted. The terminal building is kept level only through hundreds of hydraulic jacks adjusted periodically to compensate for differential settlement. The seawall has been raised repeatedly as the island's elevation dropped towards sea level. Typhoon Jebai in September 2018 proved that a direct storm surge strike on a sinking offshore airport is not a low probability catastrophe. It is a scheduled event that will repeat with increasing severity as sea levels rise. Every plane landing at Kansai lands on an airport, slowly losing its war against clay. The Bohai is the same sea system, shallower, warmer, and subjected to winter ice loading that Osaka Bay never endures. Stand at the edge of the Dalian Island today. The perimeter seawall is solid. The fill material is compacted. The piles are driven. Beyond the engineered crust of the island, the Bohai presses against the revetment armor with the rhythmic persistence of something that does not experience urgency because it does not experience time. No runway has been paved. No terminal has been constructed. No aircraft has touched this island. The infrastructure that will actually move 80 million passengers per year remains years away, structural concrete to be poured, terminal systems to be installed, runway surfaces to be laid on a foundation that is still consolidating, still expelling pore water, still undergoing the imperceptible but relentless geological adjustment that defines the behavior of reclaimed marine clay under vertical load. The island is a platform. The airport is a projection. The gap between the two is where all the risk lives. Here's the paradox that the Bohai refuses to resolve quietly. China, recognizing the catastrophic ecological damage inflicted on its coastal marine environments by decades of commercial reclamation, has in recent years imposed strict and sweeping restrictions on new commercial reclamation projects across the Bohai Sea specifically, acknowledging that the bay's hydrodynamics, its self-purification capacity, and its ecosystem functions have been so degraded by decades of seabed destruction that the damage is approaching irreversibility. And in the same regulatory framework that prohibits commercial reclamation in the Bohai, the Dalian Jinzhouwan Airport proceeds, classified as strategic national infrastructure, exempt from the prohibitions that apply to lesser projects. The sea that China has declared too damaged to reclaim further is the same sea China is building its largest airport upon. The contradiction sits in the middle of Jinzhou Bay, 20 square kilometers wide, surrounded by restricted water. What Kansai teaches, and what Dalian must absorb before its first runway paving crew arrives, is that building an artificial island is not the same as building an airport. Building an island in the sea requires you to defeat the ocean once, over a defined construction period, with a defined quantity of material. Building an airport on that island requires you to defeat the ocean every single day for the entire operational lifespan of the facility, across every storm season, every subsidence cycle, every sea level increment, every typhoon that the warming Bohai generates with increased frequency and intensity as the century progresses. The construction victory is real. The operational vulnerability begins the morning the first aircraft lands, and it never ends. The engineers at Kansai understood this theoretically in 1994. They understand it viscerally now, after 30 years of jacking, reinforcing, and watching the water creep closer to the runway surface with geological patience. Because out there, in the gray, silt-saturated water of the Bohai Sea, 4.5 kilometers from the Dalian coastline, a 20-square-kilometer island now exists where there was open bay a decade ago. More than 3,000 concrete pillars have been punched through soft clay into bedrock. The seawall stands. The fill has been compacted by machines that treated the Bohai floor as an enemy to be subdued rather than a geography to be inhabited. And somewhere in the deep clay layers beneath that engineered surface, compressed between the weight of hundreds of millions of cubic meters of fill and the bedrock 80 meters below, pore water is still moving, slowly, inevitably, millimeter by millimeter, toward the drainage paths the engineers have provided, or toward the paths the clay decides to create on its own. The sea does not rage against the seawall. It does not need to rage. It simply waits, presses, and settles. the way the sea has always responded to everything humanity has ever tried to plant on its floor.